Good evening. It works. All right, good evening. My name is Cristian Samper. I'm the director of the National Museum of Natural History, and I would like to welcome all of you here to the Smithsonian Institution, to your museum. We're delighted to be able to have this event tonight with the Community Foundation of the National Capital Region to coincide with the opening of a very interesting, exciting new exhibition that we will be opening to the public on Saturday, called Race, Are We So Different? And this, of course, the whole topic of race is an extremely important topic in our society. It's a topic that's got a lot of history. It's got science, there's history, there's many dimensions to this. And we're fortunate to bring an exhibition that was developed jointly by the American Anthropological Association in collaboration with the Science Museum of Minnesota to the museum and to the National Mall of the United States. This exhibition has been traveling around different cities in the United States to great acclaim. And the exhibition explores the stories of race from a biological, a cultural, and a historical point of view. It brings together the stories about the contemporary science of human variation, the unique American experience of race, the current cultural experiences that we all witness in society, and also the scientific findings that challenge some of the notions about race. We're delighted to have here with us tonight Virginia Dominguez, who's the president of the American Anthropological Association, as well as Eric Jolly, who's the director of the Science Museum of Minnesota, who were the partners that developed this initially. Now, this is part of a pan-institutional effort across the Smithsonian Institution that we will be kicking off this week, and that will unfold over the next 6 months to explore this not only here at this museum, but many other venues across the Smithsonian and a whole series of public events that will be dealing with the topic of race. I'd like to thank Mary Jo Arnoldi, who is the chief curator and the chair of our Department of Anthropology, as well as the Smithsonian Consortia for their funding for these activities. Now, one of the things I've always said is this exhibition, which I've seen, is not, it's a place to begin a conversation. It is a small space where we can really engage on this very important topic. And we also have learned from the other venues and from our own experience here that it's important to facilitate that conversation. So one of the things that we have done is we have trained a core of about 80 volunteers that are going to be in the exhibition working with our visitors and helping them pose questions and helping them explore the exhibition and posing and answering their own questions. So we're delighted with this, and it's been fascinating to see the group of people that volunteered for this exhibition, and they've all been through substantial training here at the museum over the last 2 months. So you will have an opportunity to do a sneak preview of the exhibition after the panel that we have tonight, but don't tell everyone. It's opening on Saturday. But of course, this coincides, and we're so pleased to have an opportunity to partner with the Community Foundation of the National Capital Region and their annual meeting. And of course, we have a wonderful lineup and a panel to talk about this conversation. They'll be very exciting and very interesting for all of us. So to tell you a little bit more about the events and doing your annual meeting, as I understand it, it's my pleasure to introduce Terry Lee Freeman, that of course all of you know. All I want to say as a resident of the greater Washington area is, Terry, we admire what you've done over the last 14 years and everything that you do here for our society and the foundations here. So without further ado, Terry Lee Freeman.
Well, good evening, everyone. Unfortunately, this is the part you have to endure, which is our, if you will, business meeting. But it's not a business meeting in the way you might think of a business meeting. Thank you, Dr. Samper, for welcoming us into your home and for reaching out to the Community Foundation as a partner in promoting dialogue, learning, and action around race. We are really happy and thrilled to be here on this evening. before the exhibit actually, the nationally touring exhibition actually opens. Race, are we so different? And we thank you for the courage to take on this topic, because this is not something that is always easy to take on. At the Community Foundation, our vision is one where equity, access, and opportunity are available to everyone. Equity in terms of policies and structures that are free of bias and favoritism as they have been in the past. Access to the American ideals of quality education, healthy food, and affordable health care. And opportunities to advance one's learning and eventually earn an income that can sustain a family. This doesn't seem like too much to ask, really. And yet we know that there are many barriers to realizing this vision, and none more vexing, frankly, than race. Think about it. We're only a few blocks away from the White House, where the leader of the free world is an African American man. Yet, the average life expectancy, and some of you may have seen the article in the Washington Post today about this, the average life expectancy of an African American man in the District of Columbia is 15 years shorter than that of a white male living here. That really puts the issue of equity into a new perspective. The issues of race and ethnicity continue to shape our community and our nation. Right here in the metropolitan Washington region, we are now a majority-minority region with dramatic growth over the past decade of our Latino and Asian populations, including many new immigrants who have joined long-standing minority communities in making this region their home. We are truly a global community, and as we look ahead, our diversity is only going to continue to grow. Are we going to embrace this diversity as an opportunity for economic, social, and cultural progress? Or will we continue to experience growing divides, often linked strongly with racial and ethnic issues born out of ignorance and fear? On a daily basis in my role as the president of the Community Foundation, I get an opportunity to see what is the human face of these divides and the consequences for all of us. But luckily, I also have the privilege of seeing and working with people who are working to reduce these divides and achieve our vision. And it is that work, frankly, that gets me up each and every day. I've visited the after-school programs run by Identity, Inc. in Montgomery County, Maryland, where they are providing a safe and nurturing place for Latino youth as an alternative to gangs in a county where these young people have the highest dropout rate and lowest graduation rate of any racial or ethnic group. I've met with the organizers of the Diamante Driver Dental Project, a fund of the Community Foundation founded after, and I'm sure many of you remember this story, after a 12-year-old African-American boy from Prince George's County died in 2007 because of an infected tooth. More than 50 African-American dentists came together with no more resources than you or I have to say, this can never happen again in our community. And they are now helping hundreds of children a year gain access to quality, free dental services through a mobile dental van and other programs, which are now being supported by the governor of Maryland. I've listened to students from some of the most challenged high schools in America right here in the District of Columbia talk about their dreams for the future and how organizations like Urban Alliance are making those dreams seem possible. Urban Alliance works with employers to create internship opportunities for young people and to give them training and supports to be successful in these jobs. For many of these kids, it's their first exposure to opportunity, and they grab it with both hands. More than 93% of Urban Alliance kids go on to college. And I've had the pleasure to work with donors to the Friends of Ballou Fund that seek to make sure that no student at Ballou is denied a college education because of lack of funds. Ballou High School has historically been defined by negative statistics, its geographic location, and the population it serves, which is 100% African American and brown students. These stories and so many more give me hope that the vision of equity, access, and opportunity can be achieved. Because in every one of these cases, there are people of every color and every hue joining together to create that change. They are involved because they care about their fellow man. While I doubt that they are colorblind, the racial differences don't outweigh being a member of the human race. We need more people who genuinely understand this and are engaged in this movement, and that's why you're here this evening. People who don't believe that there are differences in people's abilities and potential based solely on their race and/or their ethnicity that justify them being treated differently. That is what racism is and why we are here tonight. The Community Foundation is a connector. We connect resources and people to create community solutions. Sometimes those resources are in financial capital of our individual and family and corporate donors that give to causes they care about most. Sometimes those resources are in the form of unrestricted community leadership funds that go to effective nonprofit organizations throughout this region. But sometimes that resource is intellectual capital, so that we can all learn and grow in our ability to create positive change. And tonight, boy, do we have intellectual capital. We have an incredible panel of international, national, and local experts to begin this conversation about race, about racism, and about what each of us can do to achieve greater equity in this community. And it's really important that I emphasize that this is a beginning. Please don't consider this an event in time. This is something that needs to go on for a long time. We are grateful to have the perfect person this evening to guide this discussion in our moderator, Michele Norris from National Public Radio. But before we bring Michele on, let me first thank our sponsors for their very generous support of tonight's event. Wells Fargo is our lead sponsor, and they are represented here by our trustee, Sam Schreiber, who is Sam in the room? Sam? Oh, he's in traffic. Okay, so he's here in spirit. Care First, Blue Cross Blue Shield, the Consumer Health Foundation, the Diane and Norman Bernstein Foundation, and Washington Gas. You are a part of the movement, and we thank you for your support. Can we give them a hand, please? I also want to thank the individuals who served on our steering committee for this evening, whose insight and guidance was invaluable. Those meetings were quite interesting. Sometimes it took us a while to get where we needed to be, but we got there. And I'm so thankful for all of the committee participation. And of course, to our Board of Trustees. And I would like to ask all of our Board of Trustees and our advisory board members to please stand. All of these individuals are listed in your program. Our commitment to putting race on the table goes beyond this evening, as I said. For more than a decade, we have sought to open dialogue about these issues as they have specifically impacted the educational achievement gap facing our country and more specifically our region. Tonight, we will expand the conversation and look at the obvious and not so obvious racism that both creates and perpetuates social inequities. And there is no better way to really see the impact of race and racism than to get out into the community. So beginning this fall, we are offering 4 community tours in neighborhoods around the region, and each and every one of you all are invited to come. We'll get a really big bus, and we'll get everybody out there. And there is information about these tours at the registration desk. We will have tours in Montgomery County, Prince George's County, the district, and in Northern Virginia. So I would encourage you to sign up, or you can go to our website and sign up via the website. We also have a wealth of information on that website about race and racism. So please take a look at thecommunityfoundation.org and see what is on our website. Now, it is my great pleasure to welcome to the podium Mozella Perry Adamaluyi. Did I get it right? Okay. Who is a donor of the Community Foundation and a member of our Montgomery County Advisory Board and an active member of the steering committee that planned this event. Mozella is a poet, and I had the pleasure of reading some of her poetry, and I thought, wouldn't it be nice to have Mozella do a poem? And I asked her, and she willingly accepted the task. She is simply an inspiration to me and to many others, and tonight she is here to inspire all of us with this poem that she wrote for this event. So, Mozella.
Thank you very much, Terry. Good evening. Many of you, many of us have admired the ancient classical work of Khalil Gibran, the prophet. And as you remember, he wrote on giving, he wrote on work, he wrote on time and love and marriage, many, many topics. He did not write on race. So without his written permission, I have chosen to do that this evening. And so the piece that I have written is inspired by his style and inspired by the vision that is underneath this roof. And a young child said, "Speak to us on race." And she answered, "You are the same beings beneath the thin layers that cover your hearts and your souls. For the color of your skin is not really what makes you different from your neighbor. What makes you different is the color of your intentions." Many were taught by those who could not see truth, by those whose hearts were damaged by their own thoughts. But you, children of the light, will bring us back from the depths of our fears, our ignorance, and our stupidity. You shall lead us to freedom from the illnesses caused by our own erroneous thinking, thinking that told us our color made us separate from each other. For it is said that children will lead us to the promised lands of our dreams, and that they will teach us with their questions and challenge us with their answers. A growing understanding is unfolding and rising, like spring flowers breaking free through winter's cold crust, that no matter our ethnicity, we are ultimately the same. And each day, the enlightened children of our world will silence despair and destruction and bring us home to the awareness that we are truly one. Thank you.
Mozella's poem is in the program, so you have a copy of the poem in the program. Now it is my extreme pleasure to introduce Michele Norris, who is the co-host of All Things Considered on National Public Radio, which is the longest running national program on public radio. Before coming to NPR, Michele was a correspondent for ABC News, where she earned an Emmy and a Peabody for her coverage of September 11th, and was honored with the Salute to Excellence Award by the National Association of Black Journalists for her coverage of Hurricane Katrina. More recently, she was named Journalist of the Year by the National Association of Black Journalists for her coverage of the 2008 presidential campaign. And she released her first book, The Grace of Silence, which focuses on how America talks about race in the wake of the Obama presidency. Hi, Sam. I just thought I would acknowledge you because we did earlier. So Sam Schreiber from Wells Fargo, our lead sponsor. Her book also explores her family's own racial legacy. So please now join me in welcoming Michele Norris.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Terry, for that lovely introduction. People think the most important thing I do on that little show that I host on National Public Radio called All Things Considered, people think the most important thing I do is talk. The most important thing I do is listen. And I look forward to this evening because I think we are all going to have an opportunity to listen to a wonderful conversation. In the run-up to and in the wake of the recent presidential election, we started to hear a certain term an awful lot, the word post-racial. How many of you had even heard that term before the run-up to the 2008 election? It was nowhere, and then suddenly it was everywhere. And its popularity, its common usage, for many suggested that this country was sliding into a place where race was no longer important, where race was something that no longer needed to be discussed or examined or even talked about. And if it did, it would be in the past tense. It was something of the past. Well, if you pay attention to American society, you see that there are still racial disparities in this country. We see them in housing patterns. We see them in health statistics. We see them in hiring patterns and in leadership pictures. And so tonight we're going to take a look at some of these factors. And we're going to try to look at what leads to some of these things, peel back the layers a little bit. We want each of you to leave this conversation and think about the role that race and racism perhaps plays in policies and programs, in decisions that are made on a large level but also on a granular level. We hope that you've had an opportunity to look at the exhibit upstairs, and we hope that you will leave here and spend some more time, and that perhaps has put you in a framework that is exactly perfect for what you're about to hear. Anytime we talk about race, we have to recognize something important. It touches everyone. It's not just something that affects people of color or is talked about or discussed in private spaces by people of color. It affects all of us, no matter what your skin color is, no matter what your background is. And so we're going to consider that this evening also. Whenever we talk about race, it sometimes takes a little bit of courage to stand up and speak up because it's something that's not always easy to talk about. Well, we have a panel this evening that we don't have to worry about. There are people who have been thinking about this, there are people who have been very involved in many of these issues, and there are people who have no problem speaking up or speaking out. So this evening, we're going to put race on the table. In this case, coffee tables. And so let us begin. We have a wonderful panel. I'll introduce them in just a moment. Good evening. Let's do this one more time. It's beautiful outside. There's a fantastic exhibit upstairs. I have assumed that you all had a chance to socialize a little bit, and the evening feels better than your response suggests. So let's just try this one more time. Good evening. Good evening. There we go. We're joined this evening by Dalton Conley, Gustavo Torres, Tynesia Boyea Robinson, Mallika Dutt, John A. Powell, and Margaret O'Byron. And I want each of you to very quickly introduce yourselves, because I could do it, but I want you to do it in a line or two. I'm going to do two things. One, I'm going to go, Dalton, I'm going to begin with you, and you're going to give us one or two lines about what you do. And then, Margaret, we're going to work our way backwards. And when we work our way backwards, I want each of you, and I'm going to say this now to give you a chance to think about it, I want each of you to think of one statistic or snapshot that helps us understand how race factors into American society today in ways that might surprise us. Dalton, introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Dalton Conley, and my day job is as a Dean of Social Sciences and professor at New York University, and I've studied racial disparities in wealth in particular and how they affect and drive racial disparities in other domains as well.
Gustavo.
Good evening. Buenas noches. My name is Gustavo Torres, and I am the Executive Director of CASA de Maryland. We are the largest Latino and immigrant organization in Maryland.
Good evening. My name is Tynesia Boyea Robinson. I'm CEO of Reliance Methods, and I'm on the board of Europe National Capital Region, and we train young people in technology and place them in jobs.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming out this evening and for having me here. My name is Mallika, and I run Breakthrough, which is a global human rights organization that uses media, arts, and culture to spark dialogue about issues like race, migration, violence against women, sexuality. And I'm going to sit perched on my seat like this all evening because I'm really short, and if I sit back, my legs don't touch the floor. Oh my God. I just thought I'd share that with you.
So hello, my name is John Powell. I'm the director of the Kirwan Institute at The Ohio State University. It's a think, do tank, and we focus on issues like structural racialization, implicit bias in communication and power, and we work from soup to nuts. And you probably notice I am sitting back. My legs touch the floor just fine.
Yeah, here we have the long and short of it.
It's the long and short of it.
I'm Margaret O'Brien. I'm a hometown girl. I run the Consumer Health Foundation in DC, and we work in the region, and we work in the area of access to equitable care and health equity.
So Margaret, as I said, I'm going to begin with you.
Okay.
I want you to help paint a picture for us through either a statistic or an anecdote that helps us understand how race or racism or racial disparities play an important part in American life in ways that might surprise us.
Okay, this is a local story. If you live in Congress Heights in Ward 8, across the Anacostia River, you will get sicker, you will die sooner than if you lived in Friendship Heights in Ward 3. This pattern repeats itself across the region.
So health disparities that play out in lots of different ways.
Place and segregation have profound effects on health.
We're going to come back to that.
Okay.
John.
So we all know we have an African-American president in the White House, to some people's chagrin. So the country's made tremendous progress, and yet we have evidence that the country is experiencing profound and deep racial anxiety. So at the same time that we can measure a decrease in explicit racist attitudes, there's a substantial uptick in racial anxiety that gets misnamed, misunderstood, but has profound implications for our future.
Can you give us just one example of what you would consider to be racial anxiety and how it's manifest, how we see it here?
There are many, and I have clips of them, but you can think about he lied, or you can think about the birth certificate. Is Obama really an American? Or he's a Muslim, which is actually particularly interesting because when you think about the hot water that President Obama got in during the election, it was because he had this fiery Christian preacher.
Right.
So, you know, when I came to this country in 1980 to go to college, the dynamic around race and the conversation around race in the United States was really around black and white. And Native American people were completely invisible, but so was pretty much other community of color. And what's happened since 9/11 is that in the last 10 years, everyone has been made black, if you will. And what has happened as a result of that is that now Latinos are those illegal aliens, South Asians, Muslims, and Arabs are those terrorists. And as we've sort of increased the other, we are creating a dynamic in this country where with the shifting demographics, where the majority of people in this country will be people of color by 2050, if not earlier, we're just creating more and more polarization. And so I deeply believe that A, if we don't put race on the table, and B, if we don't pay particular attention to African American communities together, that our future is in peril.
Thank you. Lisa.
So the statistic that really frightens me right now is if you think about, people know about the wage inequality between African Americans and others. One dynamic with it is for government jobs, African Americans in government jobs, they make 81 cents on the dollar compared to in the private sector, 71 cents on the dollar. So, yeah, great, wonderful, more government jobs, right? Not so much. Where are they contracting all of the space? You're cutting government jobs. What that means, the underbelly of that, is that the few gains that you did have from an economic standpoint for people of color are being lost during this recession in a way that I don't think has surfaced, and it's really important to this town because most people are employed some way by the government.
A hidden statistic in that case. Gustavo.
Allow me to share two statistics. Is
You're
okay?
allowed.
Thank you very much. Number one is related, which is extraordinary, the number of Latinos who are right now in our country, 50 million, according with the census. It's a huge number. And of course, you imagine that it creates a lot of challenges as well as opportunities for all of us, for our community and for all of us. But one of the statistics that shocked me tremendously was about in Montgomery County in particular, and something that we call the feminization, as we say in Latin America, the feminization of the poverty on Montgomery County. 16% of Latinas are poor on Montgomery County, the highest concentration of all groups in one of the richest countries of the county of the nation. So to me, it's like something is going on and something is wrong in Montgomery County.
And you had two statistics. Did you want to share the second
The first one I say 50 million.
Okay. And the second
I repeat again.
I wasn't listening closely enough. Thank you. Dalton.
Sure.
Well, I was going to share something about the wealth disparity, a dime on the dollar, black, white. I'm sneaking in more statistics, just by saying what I'm not going to talk about. Or about an audit study that showed that when they had identical resumes and they had the top 10 black names, top 10 white names, employers called back the white-sounding folks. But everybody's been so pessimistic that I'm actually going to say something optimistic, I think, a statistic. And that is that the Bradley effect seems to have gone away. The Bradley effect is so named after Tom Bradley, when the former mayor of Los Angeles, who ran for governor of California in 1982, and the pre-election polling had him winning. And then on election day, he lost. And consistently, when there is a black candidate for office, there had been, David Dinkins experienced this.
Wilder?
Yeah, over and over again, you can think of examples. Folks in polls, the support for the black candidates appears to be overestimated, and that's due to social desirability bias. Not that folks are lying that they're not going to vote for the black candidate, but there's an unconscious process by which maybe they didn't get to the people who said they were going to vote for the black candidate, particularly whites, don't get to the polls that day. Or when they get in the voting booth, they switch because of national security concerns to another candidate or whatever. I wouldn't say that there's explicit lying to pollsters. There's no reason that people should lie. So that's social desirability bias. It's been a uphill battle politically. But in the last few elections, major elections, we've seen that pre-polling has matched the actual election returns. That's Deval Patrick winning in the governorship of Massachusetts, of course Obama, but even in losing races like Harold Ford, the pre-poll in Tennessee, the Senate race, the pre-polls matched what he got on election day. That's a small, a sliver of hope. I think that that some sorts of social desirability bias or some sorts of bias are perhaps eroding. It's not going to fix all these other problems everyone's listing, but I thought we needed something cheerful.
But, you know, on that happened to Doug Wilder and Harvey Gantt and several other politicians. In the presidential election, it actually had almost a reverse effect because there were more white voters who supported Barack Obama, but who appeared to tell voters that their votes were heading in another direction. Let's try to unpack some of these statistics if we can, and let's start with health, because the disparities are so stark there. African American children are 2.5 times more likely to die before their first birthday. African American women are far more likely to die in childbirth. And there's something interesting that happens to Latino women and Latino rates for infant mortality. The longer that Latinos stay in America, the more those disparities widen. So something happens, you know, once families stay in this country for a long time. How do health policies affect these disparities that we see, and are they part of the problem, or is it that the solution is not aggressive enough or tailored enough to some of these specific problems in different parts of the country? And since you raised this, Margaret, I want to begin with you.
I think the issue is that only 20% of our health is determined by health care, which is to which most health policies are directed. The other 80% are other factors, where we live, the color of our skin, segregation, whether we feel we have power over our destiny. And so I think the issue is that what we haven't done is look holistically at all policies that affect people's health. Because what happens actually is when you live under the cloud of racism, you are constantly under stress. I mean, you're constantly up against it. Somebody said it's like you keep the engine running in the car, and sooner or later, the car just stresses out. And so physiologically, you develop cortisol, this thing in your blood, which kills you. It creates hypertension, diabetes, and so I really think we've got to look more holistically at policies, and at that point, we will be improving people's health.
How do you do that through policy, though? I mean, that is, you know, do you do that through federal policy? Is that something that nonprofits have to get more involved in? I mean, you're talking about a holistic approach and this idea of sort of what some people call, some psychologists actually call weathering.
Right,
the effect of living
right.
under constant stress and the effect that has, the cumulative health problems that creates. And there's big questions about, well, so how do you deal with that? Because you're talking about, you know, systemic, long-term, lifelong cumulative effects.
You still have that? Okay, this is what I think. I think that when you talk about structural racism, you are indeed talking about policies and practices that can actually be addressed. So what I would say to you is that I would look at a place and I would say, you know what, we need to invest in the schools. You know what, we have to have grocery stores and walking and places to walk. And you would pack those policies together. And David Williams, and I'm not going to, one of my staff members here, he's a rock star, we think, in public health, but does talk about the effects of segregation on health. So, you know, I do think they're local, and I think you just work within a place.
But,
go ahead.
But also, I believe that policies, no question, at the federal level make a huge difference, for good or for bad. I mean, you see with the healthcare debate that we faced back to a year and a half ago, when President Obama spoke in front of the Congress about the importance of healthcare for the great majority of the people, he was very clear. No for people who are undocumented. Mm-hmm. And even you see the response from some of the Congress that even they say that he lied. I don't know if you recall that one, I do perfectly. That shows that we speak about almost 15 million people who are right over here in our country, who do not qualify for any kind of health services except the emergency room. Mm-hmm. So for them, the health care is the emergency room when you are very sick, you go to the emergency rooms. And the cost of the healthcare is going to have a tremendous impact.
And when you're sick, you don't go and get preventive care.
And in addition to that, if you go, so you are very scared that you are going to go and somebody is going to call immigration, right? So because we have this kind of situation happening in many occasions already, not in Arizona only, but right here in the Washington, D.C. area.
You know, I asked you about surprising statistics. I know that there are not always easy solutions, but are there in some cases surprising solutions? You mentioned, you at least alluded to food deserts, communities where there are not opportunities to buy. If you want to serve a healthy meal, it's hard to do that because the local store doesn't sell fresh food or doesn't make it easy for you to serve a consistently healthy diet to your family. So are there other examples of that that are actually fairly easy things to do, what some people might call low-hanging fruit that we could...
There's fruit. I don't know if it's low-hanging.
I know. I agree with that.
It's a great book. I think it's a great book called Spirit Level. And there's a documentary called Is Inequality Making Us Sick? And they argue that, and have very strong statistics showing that the more unequal a society, the more these negative outcomes from obesity, from death, mortality, that in a sense this is a manifestation of widening inequality in our society at every level. And inequality itself is really indicative of something else, which is a sense of not belonging. And that's really what racialization or racism is. It's basically saying whether it's certain people, whether it's Native Americans, whether it's Latinos, whether it's, is that you don't belong. And then we organize our society to reflect that lack of belonging. It's disrespect. And in that sense, it's surprising because we think of belonging or respect as sort of soft things, but they get manifested in structures. Not only the structures of our mind and heart, but also, you know, when we talk about segregation, we're talking about people being segregated from opportunity, being segregated from respect. That it's a stigma. That's what Brown talked about, the stigma of segregation. So those things would be relatively easy to change, and they don't necessarily cost a lot of money. And they could have a powerful impact in terms of outcomes.
So some of what you're talking about is changing attitudes.
Excuse me?
Some of what you're talking about is changing attitudes.
Yes, except I would say you change two things. I would say these attitudes, and as I said, we deal a lot with the implicit, which is the unconscious. And about 98% of our emotional and cognitive functions are unconscious, even more. They're social functions. They're not individuals. So it's not what we like to say is change one individual at a time. That's not how these cognitive functions actually populate our society. These are social functions, and they're reflected in our structures. So there's a powerful relationship between structural racialization on one hand and implicit bias on the other. So it's not one or the other. They go together, they move together, and if you change one, you impact the other.
How aware, there are many fascinating stories on implicit bias. In fact, there's a test that you can even go online and take where you go through a series of cues and they measure how quickly you attribute positive, how quickly you ascribe positive attributes to people of color and negative attributes in the opposite fashion. And many people who do this, I've done it myself, are quite surprised by the results. And I took the test a second time. That can't be right. I have to do this again. And actually, because I was doing some research called Brian Nosek, who most of you probably know, and he said, oh, everyone takes it again. They never believe the results. How much are people aware of that?
Well, in this is, first of all, two things. Because it's implicit means we're not aware of it, right? Yeah. But most of us, we like to believe that we have control, access to what we feel and know. And just to give you one statistic, at any given time, we're processing 11 million bits of information. And the most optimistic assertion is we can only be aware of 40. Wow. 40 out of 11 million. So most of what's going on, we have no idea. But this is not just random. We can also prime people, or people can be socialized so they notice certain things and they don't notice certain things. So it's not just the distribution that's random. So the way we do race, the way we do gender, the way we do age is a social phenomenon that tells us what's important, what's not important, what's the value, what's not the value. And that's why I said early on, we can have people expressly more racially fair and at the same time having tremendous racial anxiety.
Can I just take off from what he's saying? You know, there's also been a lot of articles recently about the fact that people don't necessarily follow a logic model based on rational arguments, that facts alone don't necessarily change people's perceptions of reality around them. So the climate change debate, for example, is used as a way to demonstrate where, you know, you have all of the scientific evidence, but it's still something that ends up getting challenged. And really the power of narrative in our societies, the power of storytelling, and what stories we tell, repeat, hear, I think are absolutely critical to what you're saying. So the power of narrative around race is black men are all criminals. 3 out of black men who did not go to high school are going to spend some time in prison. But the whole criminal justice system in our country has an extremely punitive, punishment-oriented approach behind it. Then we kind of connect that to our drug laws. And there's certain kinds of drug offenses that lead to African American men getting incarcerated way, way more than Caucasian men would, right? So the narrative and the structure and then the impact of that narrative are all getting connected. Now, illegal immigrants are criminals, right? So now you're criminalizing the entire Latino community. So putting millions and hundreds of thousands of people into detention and deportation proceedings and just deporting people, even if they have green cards. I mean, you're also seeing the undermining of the civil rights that people have had all of these years. It's okay because they're criminal, therefore they have no rights. So there's a whole way in which there's a story that emerges around a label, around what you're called. And you know, you see that happening around gender with all of the stuff flying around with Schwarzenegger and our congressman in New York and, you know, the head of IMF, where there's a narrative in their heads around women as objects, as sexual objects in a certain way that allows them to act as if they can do it with impunity, right? So I feel like while we're talking about policy change, while we're talking about very practical solutions on the ground, attitudes change with the power of narrative. And not just facts, it's the stories we tell, and it requires many of us to start changing those stories and changing those narratives in order to get to the kind of equitable outcomes that we're talking about.
I think it's a combination, though, of the narrative and the results. So the individual has to experience a progress of enough data points where their perception changes. And I see that every day with the young people that I've served at Year Up. We have to teach them how to package themselves. And everyone talks about, you know, the hard and soft skills, but it's actually the hard and harder skills. Technology is easy. Our young people are very talented. Doesn't matter what community they come from, they do wonderfully. 90% of our young people go to higher education and have jobs. But teaching them how to dress, teaching them how to talk, teaching them how to walk through the political landmines, the journey that I've seen people who invest in Year Up and a young person, the first response is, oh my God, I can't believe they're so great. Oh, they're just so not like the others. And then the next response is, you know what, I think I'd like to have another Year Up student because they're doing better than some of the others. And then the last response where you really know you've changed it is, hey Minty, how come you're not graduation speaker? Like I thought you were, you know, Year Up has a high bar, you should be doing that. And that nuance is really important because if you treat the success as an exception, the narrative is still, this group is criminal. But if you treat it as the rule is success, the rule is talent, that's when you really get to be able to change not just the policies, but the framework and the fabric of how the whole population is treated.
Do the young people that you work with feel that they need to challenge that narrative? How do they see themselves?
You know, the hardest thing, I think, from Year Up every day, we have a program where it's high support, high expectations, and you can fire yourself from the program if you're not consistently professional, so if you're not there on time, or you're not dressed professionally. And the thing that's the worst is right before they're going on these internships with the Carlyle Group and Marriott and these Fortune 1000 companies, you start to see them self-sabotaging, because being successful means they no longer have a network. No one's been in their shoes. They can't ask you for advice on what it's like. They don't know what to talk about at the water cooler, and it frightens them so much. They would rather not go so they can rely on the network that they've had their whole lives than to go and be alone and isolated.
How much of that is something that Claude Steele would call stereotype vulnerability, that you become a victim of the stereotypes that are foisted upon you by society?
You know, I was telling Dalton and John that we use the video Race, the Power of an Illusion. Internalized oppression is real. The belief that this is who I am because everyone in my neighborhood is in this place and therefore the only thing I can be is this is real. It's a hard thing to overcome, and to say not only can you do it, which I think most people get to, but you deserve to be there. You're an equal, you're among peers. We have young people right now who are at the White House. The president, visited us, and they're interning there, and they came back and they said, I'm both really excited, but also I feel out of place because everyone here is from an Ivy League and I'm from Ward 7, Ward 8. Why am I here? The only people who look like me are serving food. Why am I here?
Well, just one thing I think is important. Certainly there's a lot of anxiety, and you mentioned Claude's work. Claude's a friend of mine. Stereotype threat. He's written a new book called Whistling Vivaldi, where he talks about this. But there's another piece that I really think is important not to miss, and that is that, so part of it is how do we actually get young people of color, and older people of color to deal with stereotype threats. But that doesn't actually, that's not what's causing racial anxiety in whites. And I think it's really important in terms of a narrative not to think the problem is how do we fix people of color so that they can actually then have access to all these wonderful opportunities. The structure of opportunity in this country is profoundly racialized, and it's being more racialized to some extent despite our change in attitudes, in part caused by white anxiety. And so when people talk about taking our country back, they're not talking about taking it back from gangs, they're talking about taking it back from Obama.
That's true. So if this is a difficult question, if there is institutional racism or racial disparities that persist throughout important institutions, how do you address that problem without putting the people who run those institutions automatically on the defensive? Because if there is institutional racism, does that suggest that the people who run the institutions are involved in a certain act of racism themselves, or have they been asleep at the switch or not active enough? You put people automatically in a defensive posture, which doesn't lead then to productivity in many cases. How do you deal with that in trying to address some of these problems?
Well, one thing I would say is that, and there's again, if you think of historically, if after the Civil War, there was tremendous anxiety in the white community. It eventually showed itself in redemption and the end of Reconstruction. And we got Jim Crow and all the other stuff. I think the country really wants, including whites, really wants a different future, a different story. And to try to hold on this racial lid, which some people will, creates tremendous anxiety, creates tremendous fear. One of the fastest, a colleague of mine and friend just wrote, Mass Incarceration is the New Jim Crow. One of the fastest growth in jobs is in terms of prisons. People want an alternative. They don't necessarily know how to get there. And part of our job is to help them because in a sense, and Dr. King talked about this system is not just punishing people of color, it's actually punishing whites. They're acting out of fear, they're acting out of anxiety, and as you already suggested, anxiety and fear doesn't help any of us. Yeah. So I think there's another alternative where it's not a zero-sum game, where there are new ways of thinking about it, a new America, better angels, and I think that's part of our task.
I believe that is very important, and right here in our country it's very difficult to speak about, honestly, about racism and classism. And I think that is really important that, we have that kind of conversations in different places, right? In different locations, in the universities, in different because it's the only way how we are going to address that issue when we really honestly speak about that issue. And I just want to put just one particular example. When we were fighting for the DREAM Act in Maryland to allow these kids, beautiful kids, to go to college. And we saw the debate right over there in Annapolis, where honestly was very clear there was racism, where the entitled African American and Latino delegates and senators strongly support the importance of these minorities to go to college, of course, because it's the future, right? And you see a group of people who are really conservative, very clear, describing why we cannot give opportunity to those kids. And one of the senators, I remember, African American senator, clearly went to the history and says exactly what you said with us back to 40 years ago, that we were not ready to go to college because racism is not was because different things, it's because a very clear racism. So I believe that it's important to have that kind of conversation directly.
And I think the first step on it is defining and acknowledging unearned privilege. And it can't be a kind of a theoretical, it's got to be a below the neck exercise. So one thing that we do at Year Up that our board member who's here, John King, has done is we do this exercise called the privilege line. And everybody stands, and you get the questions like, did you have a book? What?
We should explain that. Everyone stands in the line.
Yeah, so the privilege line, everybody stands in the line. And then the facilitator asks a series of questions, like how many books did you have when you were growing up? Do you usually see yourself as in your management? Like just a list of questions.
And you take a step forward.
And you take a step forward if you answer affirmative, and you take a step back if you don't. And then you debrief in small groups, and there are grown men, heads of, CEOs of major companies bawling afterwards, because it's one thing to listen to stats and it's one thing to hear, but it's another thing to say, oh my God, people don't have books? Like, oh my God, I never realized that. I thought because my parents were immigrants and that we had to work really hard, that, we were all on the same page, but whoa, you're starting in a completely different room, and the room just spreads out in a way where just the silence of seeing the privilege line does something to people. And you have to have like those visceral moments where people, it sits with them and they're going through their 11 million processing and it spits out someplace later on.
We call it the power walk. It's so interesting. I've never heard it called the privilege line. We call it the power walk. I mean, that's the way we've always used it. And the thing is that it also shows the differences in power amongst communities of color. I mean, one of the things that I want to add to this conversation is that this is not a white people of color issue. This is an issue of a country which is going through massive demographic changes, where there are all kinds of fissures and problems and challenges that we're facing. I mean, it's not like I'm Indian American. It's not like my community is the same as the African American community, and God knows there's no one Indian American community either. There's the guys who are the big finance, the people who've made their millions on Wall Street, and then there are all the cabbies in New York City and everybody in between. And we have a way of creating these essential constructs of, Indian Americans are all doctors or lawyers or on Wall Street and really successful. Well, get in a cab in New York and you'll find out otherwise. But how do we have these conversations within and across in ways that don't just make this about an us and them, but how do we deal with all of this together?
Part of it is when we look at this word, race. We still are locked into a sort of civil rights construct when we think about race, a sort of, PBS February documentary type review. And I say that as someone from public broadcasting with great love and great respect for PBS, for the recent PBS offering, the fantastic Freedom Writers. But as America, we sort of think of race in terms of black and white. And Dalton, how much does that hamstring the essential conversation?
Well, I think a lot of the panel is focused on attitudes. And I think John pointed out that attitudes and social structure in dialogue with each other and reinforce each other. And I think that I would put more of the causal weight on the structure and on economics than on consciousness raising. And so in order to change the way we feel, or even our implicit or explicit behavior or biases, we need to change the structure, and policy is very powerful at that. And there are certain forces, again, to try to be the optimist here. I think that the more that race becomes complicated and gets away from the sort of 1960s kind of civil rights narrative, the better. It becomes more like ethnicity. So, for example, something good that's happened in the last 10 years, or I guess dozen years, is that now there's multiple racial categories on the census. You can check more than one category. That complicates the story. You have increased immigration from majority black countries. That complicates the African American, the president himself complicates the African American narrative. But really, I mean, those are small things. We're going to become a majority, minority. We're going to become a plurality country soon enough, and some states are already there. That complicates the traditional narrative that's been kind of dominant in American culture. However, I think until we deal with some of the fundamental economic structures, we're not going to fix. It's going to be tinkering on the edges. So
fundamentals, I mean, economic structure. So you're talking about jobs, you're talking about housing, you're talking about educational access?
Yeah, I mean, mostly I'm talking about wealth, the fact that, that money, green is the only color I'm talking about, that African Americans, to take the extreme cases, African Americans have 10 cents on the dollar of whites. Now, Latinos fit in the middle there, Asian Americans are closer to whites, Native Americans can be actually worse off or better off depending on which tribe, and casinos and all that kind of stuff. However, so it's really actually hard to separate out what's race and what's economics, and the legacy of race from the history of the country that's manifests in the economic statistics today. So
I'm going to play devil's advocate with you. A conservative Republican who might be participating in this conversation might say that you argue that government policy helps solve the problem. They might say, not so. In fact, the best way to solve the problem is to let government step aside and let market forces step in. And if that happens, more jobs will be created. People will be less dependent on the government. They will learn how to stand up for themselves and for their families. I'd like you to respond.
I think that the market generally, it is probably the best institution to sort of create overall wealth, but in terms of equity, it's one of the worst institutions. I'll give you an example going back to the first example of health. So who do you think dies of brain cancer more, blacks or whites? It's actually whites. White, if you look at men, for example, or women, white men have the highest, the most privileged group has the highest rate of death from brain cancer. Why? Because we can't do nothing about brain cancer. There's nothing you can do. And I mean, there are some exceptions to that, but generally, we don't know what causes it. We still think our cell phones are causing it. We don't know what's going on. People staying away from the microwave. It's very idiosyncratic. But now look at something like lung cancer or smoking or diet. Before 1954, rich people had higher lung cancer death rates than poor people. Whites had higher death rates than minorities. In the 1960s, rich folks, white folks, had worse diets than poor folks because rich folks could afford full cream milk, they could afford meat every day, et cetera, et cetera. Now we know those things are not so good, but the moment that sort of information or some treatment option comes out, like the Surgeon General's report, or we know how to treat certain diseases, then a disparity emerges. So should we not cure cancer or AIDS because it's going to create a disparity? No, we should. Of course we should. But I think only the government can step in and try to say, well, the market is going to come up with the cure for lung cancer, but the government has a role in making sure that it gets to everybody and that that gap doesn't emerge when we can actually do something positive about something. That's called the fundamental cause hypothesis of health disparities. And that's the most depressing kind of narrative to me of all those.
We've been talking a lot about race and narrative. And when you talk about narrative, words count. And we've heard different versions, different derivatives of the word race. Race, racism, racialization, racial disparities. But we haven't talked so much about class. How important is class in this discussion? And is it underestimated, the importance or the role of class when we talk about race?
Let me say a couple of things about that. First, I think probably the only thing in this country that we understand less well than race is class. And you know, it's funny because in the 1950s, you couldn't have a class discussion because we were sort of afraid of communism. When we start moving on race, it's like, let's not talk about race, let's switch back to class. The reality is, class in the United States and race in the United States are so closely related, and almost no one understands because no one is, you know, in the United States, 90 to 95% of the people call themselves middle class. People making $5,000, people making $500,000. We don't have a clue what we really mean about class. But again, race and class are profoundly related in the United States. And I want to go back to just for a moment what Dalton was just saying. I think it's really important. Part of what this suggests is that we need to really pay attention to the structures and institutions and the work they're doing. I would suggest that many of the structures and institutions we're doing live in right now are not only perpetuating racial inequality and racial disparities, they're actually accelerating it. In the subprime crisis, blacks lost 22 years worth of wealth. We are further behind as a group than we were before the subprime crisis. There's been no public intervention, none. And if you look at a number, the plan that's being talked about in terms of housing and fixing the subprime crisis, in terms of how much money you have to put down, as much as 20%, would have profound impact on the Black and Latino and poor communities. It actually would those structures would actually make things worse. And those structures are coming out of the administration today, with Obama in the White House. The plan that's been floated in the White House in terms of fixing the subprime crisis calls for 20% down and a 25% requirement of having equity in the house to take money out. The racial implications of that would be profound, but we don't pay attention to that. We think of race almost entirely in terms of interpersonal. So we really have to look at how our schools, our taxes, our housing, how these things interact to produce racialized outcomes. And I'd be happy to have a longer discussion. I've written a long article about the relationship between race and class. It's not one or the other. They're profoundly interrelated. But we use that and oftentimes to avoid the race discussion, thinking we can always reduce it to economics, which we cannot.
I think too in health it's interesting because when you sort of control for wealth and income, you still see worse health outcomes for communities of color, which is, and there's a huge study about this called Unequal Treatment, which gets at the whole issue of racism. And so while wealth certainly determines your health, there's this huge other factor that gets at more at the policy conversation. And then secondly, I just wanted to throw something in terms of new structures for wealth building in poor communities. There's an interesting model that started out in Cleveland, and it's built around worker cooperatives, where people living in the neighborhood who have these jobs, the wealth stays in the neighborhood, and services are contracted through anchor institutions like hospitals, places that are in neighborhoods who really haven't paid attention to the life around them. And people are looking at this as like a kind of a new economic wealth generating model as opposed to an income generating model.
I want to take the framework for this discussion, the name of this discussion, putting race on the table, and pose this question. And think about the institutions that you all represent, whether it's a university setting, whether it's here in Washington, D.C., where important policy decisions are made. When people put
race on the table? Do people of all races enthusiastically pull up a chair? Or is this discussion something that happens more often among people of color? Does white America have a place at that table, or do white Americans enthusiastically participate in those discussions? Do all people pull up a chair, or not?
It's either you or
You see how easy is that discussion? Everybody jump immediately. I think that is very difficult for people who have privileges to have that conversation, of course, because we are speaking about your privileges. We are speaking about how you, rich person, are impacting the poor people because you have a lot of wealth. Many people don't have, or have very, very few things. So I think that that is the reason why it's really, really difficult. And I just want to answer to your Republican friend that you described before about the market, because I think that is really, really important, and how the intervention of the state can make a huge difference on these class, race disparities. And I believe that is really, really essential that you see, for instance, where the state or the federal government have an intervention in the contracts, for instance, for minorities. The middle class grows tremendously because it gives opportunities to minorities to participate on those contracts. In Maryland, for instance, we don't have that kind of things. And Baltimore is the second worst in the nation in terms of contract for minorities. And that is a very good example, and you can explain why the minorities, the African American and Latino community in that particular area are really poor, because it's not very clear intervention of the state to facilitate that process.
I think I've had a pretty great experience with the governors of our organization being really enthusiastic about pulling a seat up to the table in terms of race. I think the challenge comes in on how do you make it a deep conversation and not a surface level. Some of the surface level easy responses are voyeurism. Tell me what it's like to be black, because I really want to know. You know, so
I think it's Latino.
or there's the Me Too syndrome, which is, as a woman, I've experienced this too, and I just know we are sisters, and I mean, there's so many outlets to like, please just tell me I'm not racist because I'm a really good person and I like people. Come on, let's get along. And the only way to do that is great facilitation and a safe space to really say what you're thinking. And so few organizations actually build the trust and the time to be able to do that, where it's like, in this room, say it, say ouch if it bothers you, explain why, but you stay at the tip of the iceberg and at the surface level if you're not facilitating it.
So part of the challenge is not just getting people to the table, but getting them to stay at the table when the conversation turns prickly.
Yes.
And I think that when it's defined as a healing conversation, that's really, really important. Our board, which is diverse, actually had these conversations as we decided to develop a racial equity frame. And what was also important was to have, and this is sort of practical, a really good facilitator, that you need another person through whom sometimes you tell your story. The journey took, I have some board members here, a couple years, but, and it was hard and there were tears, but people stuck with it because they felt it was a healing space and again, a really safe space.
And the word is vulnerability.
Yeah.
My board chair, who's in the audience, he kicked off our diversity and cultural competency. He's not one who's very shy. He was like, my mother was a racist. It was like, whoa, is that how we're starting this conversation? But he was like, I'm going to put myself full out there for everyone in this room, person who leads a tech company, person who's in Carlisle Group, all of you people who are used to, like, your day is about not being invincible. And I'm going to start it off with the leadership of vulnerability. Totally different conversation. And it made sense. It was very important that he was leading the conversation as the chair and the peer versus me.
So how important is it to also acknowledge that people of color sometimes tell their sons and daughters not to trust
people who don't look like them?
Oh, I'm taking it to my son. You know, I struggle with this one a lot. I want, you know, I have a 3-year-old. He's beautiful. His name is Dylan. And I want him to be able to operate, live, navigate in a society, but I want to prepare him for the ugliness of it too, so it doesn't derail him. And I've adopted the stance that I'm not going to say, oh, don't trust people who are white, but I probably will say some things like, you know, make sure that you're not the only person in a room full of white women without a chaperone versus a certain time. I'm just saying, like, I'm just saying.
That's the reality.
So one thing, you know, just on
Keep it
Dot,
real.
dot, dot.
before he leaves this discussion, I think, you know, you asked us, I want to go back to your last question, which is bringing people to the table and keeping them at the table. First of all, this is about a conversation about everyone. And it's more than a question about everyone, it's a question about the things, the structures, the systems, the policies in our society that we constantly recreate. There's very strong evidence in showing that white folks think about race a lot. The white folks, they may not talk about it a lot, but they think about it a lot. You know, the whole thing about states' rights. I mean, everybody knows that's a conversation about race. So let's not talk about race, let's talk about states' rights. But also, I think in today's discourse, when talking about race is not the same as talking about racism. It is true that and what we do get people to the conversation, and we do give them the implicit test. And all of us carry those implicit biases with us, and they're social. And it doesn't mean that we're not have some responsibility, but it means we're not only responsible. And I think that's very different when we say, the only way we can talk about this is first you have to admit that your mother was a racist. You know, it's like, don't be talking about my mother. You don't even know my mother. You know?
Leave her out of this.
I don't feel that. You know, so I think the question is not if, the question is how. We talk about race all the time. Sometimes we like to avoid the reality that we're talking about race. So how do we become skillful? And I think a lot of the work around structures and around the mind science gives us a different way to talk about race in the 21st century.
We could go on all evening, but I have to wrap things up because we want to make sure that we have time for the next stage of the festivities this evening. Many of you received race cards when you came in, which was an invitation for you to think about how you would talk about your experiences, your observations, your thoughts, your views, your anthem, based on race in one sentence that only has 6 words. And so, I know it sounds difficult, but actually it can be profound and very interesting, and that's how we're going to say goodbye this evening. If you could each, Margaret, just very quickly tell us how you think about race in 6 words or less.
Okay,
Actually, 6 words would be perfect. I'm putting you on the spot.
Okay, weaving shared narratives and taking it to the streets. It might be 7.
We'll put the other 2 in parentheses.
Okay, that's it.
All right, John.
Opportunity and deep spiritual anxiety.
Mallika.
We're all in this together.
How do I prepare my son?
How do I prepare my son? Gustavo.
Race and class are totally related.
Are what?
Totally related.
Not necessarily about physical appearance.
Perfect. Keep talking, keep listening. Thank you.
I hope your applause signals how much you got from this conversation, and I hope you have some questions, because we would like you to continue this conversation during the reception. Now, because it was such a rich conversation, it went on a little longer than we planned, which means our reception will be a little shorter than it was planned, but we want you to partake of the refreshments and the food that's available. And we also want you to be able to see some of the exhibit, which is up on the 3rd floor. The staff have maps of the tours that I mentioned early on, and I really hope that you will consider joining us in one or more of those tours. I think my 6 words, and I'm not sure it's 6, would be, we're far more alike than we are different. I want to thank Michele Norris, and I want to thank the entire panel for providing us such a rich conversation. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And I hope you all will participate in the reception so that people can ask questions and just talk with you. So please sign up for the tours, go on the website. I just put up a new blog that talked a little bit about privilege and my experience with that personally. So I hope you'll go on the website, check out the resources that we have, and add to them. Thank you so much. Go out and enjoy the reception.